Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are not just looking at history, we are looking at the machinery of influence.
That is right. And the text we're grappling with today is a heavy hitter, maybe one of the heaviest we've ever put on the table.
It's a foundational text for sure.
We are doing a deep dive into The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman.
And that title alone, it's a lot to take in.
It is. I have to admit, when I first picked this up, the title felt like a slap in the face. It sounds like a political manifesto or maybe an angry pamphlet you get handed on a college campus.
It's deliberately provocative.
But the way we're going to approach this, and honestly the way the authors approach it, is much more like a blueprint. We are looking at a schematic of a machine.
Exactly. And I think it is crucial to set the ground rules right now. The mission here isn't to re-adjudicate the Cold War.
No.
We aren't here to get bogged down in partisan finger-pointing or to decide who the bad guys were in 1975.
That's not what this show is about.
The mission of this deep dive is a systems analysis. We are looking at what the authors call the political economy of human rights.
Which is a fascinating phrase, political economy. It implies that human rights aren't just these abstract moral concepts that float in the ether,
Right.
but that they're commodities. They can be traded, valued, or, devalued based on economic markers.
Precisely. The premise we're exploring today is how U.S. foreign policy, corporate interests, and media systems interact to create a very specific global structure.
A structure with a purpose.
A structure with a purpose.
Yeah.
And the argument the authors make, supported by a truly massive amount of data, is that this structure systematically outsources terror to client states.
To what end?
To ensure economic stability.
So we're going to set a specific tone for this conversation. We're going to look at these institutions, the government, the corporations, the media, as rational actors responding to incentives.
Yes, that's key.
We aren't looking for villains twirling mustaches in a dark room. We are looking for systems doing exactly what they are designed to do.
Rational actors responding to two specific incentives: investment access and labor control.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think the best place to start isn't even with the content of the book,
No, not at all.
but with the story of the book itself. Because honestly, the publishing history of this text is a story that is crazier than the content inside it.
It's remarkably meta.
It's a perfect case study of the media theory the authors are proposing.
It really is. To understand this, you have to go back to the early 1970s. This book was originally a monograph planned for publication by a company called Warner Modular.
Warner Modular. Now, that wasn't some, underground press.
Right at all. It was a subsidiary of the massive Warner Communications conglomerate. They were a legitimate outfit, part of the establishment.
Right. So you have this relatively small publisher. They have a contract with Chomsky and Herman. They have the text, and they're ready to go.
They're enthusiastic about it. And then the corporate parent gets involved.
The mothership.
The mothership.
Okay.
In 1973, just as they were about to publish, a senior executive from the parent company, a man named William Sarnoff, gets his hands on the proofs.
Okay.
He starts reading. And he is absolutely horrified.
Wait, back up. Sarnoff sees the proofs. What exactly triggered him? Was it the tone? Was it a factual error?
It was the core thesis itself. He read a sentence alleging that the United States was a primary instigator of post-WWII bloodbaths.
That's a strong claim.
A very strong claim. Specifically, that the U.S. leadership served as the moral and material sustainer of serious atrocities. And he just, the record shows he couldn't handle it.
So he sees this as unpatriotic.
Deeply. Sarnoff and his associates were reportedly deeply pained by the idea. He viewed it as a direct attack on the country, on the very system that allowed his corporation to flourish.
Okay, so he's personally offended, but there's a contract.
There was a legally binding contract.
Mm-hmm.
But despite that, Warner moved to suppress the book.
And when we say suppress, I want to be clear about what that looks like. We don't mean they just stopped buying Facebook ads or put it on the back shelf.
No. This was a scorched earth response. I mean, it was total. They effectively shut down the publisher. Warner Modular was dismantled.
The entire company.
The entire publishing house. And there were about 20,000 printed copies of the book that already existed. Physical books sitting in a warehouse.
Right.
They were destroyed, pulped, turned back into mush.
That is intense. 20,000 books turned into pulp because an executive at a parent corporation found the ideas unpatriotic.
And they didn't stop there. The advertising for it was canceled.
Yeah.
Any flyers listing the book were destroyed. They explicitly warned the officers of Warner Modular that distributing this document would result in immediate dismissal.
It was a purge.
It was a complete and total purge of an idea from a corporate system.
I have to stop you there, because describing the U.S. government and major media corporations as just rational actors earlier, and now hearing this, it sounds like we're letting them off the hook.
I see why it feels that way.
Are we saying there's no morality involved, just a machine running on code? Because burning books feels pretty emotional to me.
That is exactly the uncomfortable friction the authors want you to feel. If you look for a villain twirling a mustache, you miss the point.
How so?
If William Sarnoff at Warner truly believes he is a patriot, if he believes this text is a lie that harms his country, then in his mind, he isn't being evil when he pulps those books.
He thinks he's doing the right thing.
He thinks he is protecting the national honor, he is acting rationally within his belief system, and crucially, within the corporate interest. The horror isn't the malice, it's the efficiency.
And this leads us to the first major concept of the deep dive, brainwashing under freedom.
That is a provocative term, isn't it? It's designed to be.
It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel. It doesn't sound like something that happens in a democracy.
Well, it's meant to be jarring. In a totalitarian state, censorship is easy to spot. The state issues a decree. They say you cannot print this.
The government hand is visible.
It's very visible. They send the secret police to raid the office. You know you are being censored.
But here, there was no government decree. The CIA didn't storm the Warner offices. Kissinger didn't call Sarnoff.
Exactly. This was a private decision made by concentrated private power.
Yeah.
The insight Chomsky and Herman offer is that in so-called free societies, market mechanisms and internalized corporate values act as a filter.
A filter.
A very effective one. They filter out unacceptable thoughts just as effectively as a state censor, but without the messy fingerprints of the government.
So Sarnoff didn't need a call from the White House. He just needed to look at the text and realize it threatened the corporate ideology.
Or the patriotic narrative that business relies on to function. It was an autoimmune response from the corporate body.
And because it happens in the private sector, it's often defended as an exercise of freedom. The corporation has the freedom not to publish.
Of course, that's the argument. But the net result for the public is that a dissenting view, one backed by substantial research, is erased from the marketplace of ideas.
The market effectively censors itself.
To align with state power, yes.
It's censorship by market structure. If the ideas don't fit the business model of the conglomerate, the ideas disappear.
Which brings us to the core of what that suppressed text was actually trying to say. Why was it so dangerous?
Yes, what was so unacceptable?
We need to talk about subfascism.
Right. This is a key term in the books, but I have to ask, why invent a new word? We know what fascism is. We think of Hitler, Mussolini, goose-stepping soldiers, mass rallies. Why subfascism?
It's a crucial distinction. The authors separate classic fascism from what they see in the Third World during the Cold War.
And the key difference is?
The base of support. Hitler and Mussolini, for all their monstrous evil, had significant popular support. They mobilized the masses. They had a twisted kind of populism.
There were huge crowds cheering them on.
Huge crowds. But subfascism is different.
Very different. Subfascism, as seen in the U.S. client states of the Cold War era, think Latin America, Southeast Asia, has little to no popular support. I mean, virtually none. In fact, it is often at war with its own population. So how does it survive if the people hate it? If you don't have the masses cheering at the rally, how do you stay in power?
It relies entirely on force. And, crucially, it relies on foreign sponsorship.
Ah.
The leadership in these sub-fascist states is often what the authors call denationalized.
Denationalized. That's an odd concept for a leader of a nation, meaning their allegiance isn't to their own country.
It means their allegiance, their culture, and their economic interests are aligned with the foreign sponsor, usually the United States, rather than their own citizenry.
So these are elites who look outward for survival.
Completely. They speak English, they send their kids to American schools, they keep their money in Miami or Zurich. Their fate is tied to Washington, not to the people in the countryside.
The authors also use a term that I found really striking, and it sounds like something out of a mob movie, the shakedown state.
Yes. And this reframes the whole idea of corruption. We often hear about corruption in the Third World as if it's a bug in the system. We say, oh, if only they could clean up their act, democracy would flourish.
We treat it like a moral failing of the locals.
Exactly. Chomsky and Herman argue that in a sub-fascist system, corruption isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It is the point.
How can corruption be a feature?
Because the elites are there to milk the state. They use foreign aid and state power for personal gain. That's their reward. But in exchange for that privilege, the privilege of looting their own treasury, they open the door to foreign capital.
They're the gatekeepers.
They are the gatekeepers. They take a cut, and in return, they let U.S. corporations come in and extract resources, use cheap labor, and operate with minimal regulation.
So it's a transaction. The local elite gets to loot the treasury, and the foreign corporation gets a compliant government that won't give them any trouble.
It's a perfectly symbiotic relationship from their perspective. And this brings us to the structural alignment with U.S. objectives.
Right. Why does the U.S. support these regimes? Why prop up a government that hates its own people?
The authors argue it comes down to one phrase: the investment climate.
I feel like we hear that phrase in financial news all the time, a favorable investment climate. It sounds so benign, like checking the weather forecast before a picnic.
It sounds lovely. It sounds like something everyone would want. But we need to translate that into on-the-ground reality.
What does it actually mean?
What does a favorable investment climate actually require in a developing nation? It requires stability. But specifically, it requires a lack of labor unrest.
Meaning you don't want workers going on strike.
You don't want unions demanding higher wages. You don't want peasants demanding land reform. You don't want a government that might, tax foreign profits to build local schools.
You want predictability.
You want absolute predictability and control over costs, especially labor costs.
So democracy, by its very nature, is unstable for a foreign investor.
That is the grim logic presented in the book. Democracy allows the underlying population, the bottom 80%, to have a voice.
And if they have a voice,
they ask for a better share of the pie. They want health care, they want land, they want fair wages, and all of that hurts profits.
But subfascism?
Subfascism is stable because its first act is to destroy the unions, suppress the peasant leagues, and keep labor costs artificially low through force.
It creates stability by silencing the population.
Exactly. The book uses Brazil as a major example here, the so-called economic miracle after the 1964 coup.
Right, I remember reading about that. It was celebrated in the West.
It was. In the financial press, in the Wall Street Journal of the time, post-1964, Brazil was hailed as a miracle. GDP went up. Foreign investment poured in. It was a bonanza.
For whom?
For the investors and the top 5% of Brazilians. For the vast majority of Brazilians, the actual population, it was a disaster.
How so?
Wages were repressed, social services were cut. The data shows that malnutrition actually increased during the miracle.
So the miracle was wealth extraction.
Wealth extraction, made possible by the enforced silence of the workforce.
And that silence wasn't voluntary. That silence was enforced by the military.
By the military? Yes. And by the ideology that drove them, the national security doctrine.
Okay, let's break that down. National security doctrine sounds very official, very legitimate. What does it actually mean for a citizen on the ground?
Think of the national security doctrine like an autoimmune disorder for a country.
An autoimmune disorder, explain that.
In a healthy body, the immune system fights foreign invaders, viruses, bacteria. In the national security doctrine, the military, the state's immune system, decides that the body itself is the threat.
The citizens are the virus.
The labor unions, the students, the priests, the journalists, they aren't citizens with rights anymore, they're the virus. And the military's job is to purge them to save the state.
So the state is elevated above the people.
The state is absolute. The individual is nothing. It justifies total war against internal enemies.
And internal enemy is a very elastic label.
It's an incredibly elastic label. It essentially means anyone who dissents. A priest organizing a food cooperative, a student leader demanding free elections, a union rep asking for a pay raise. They all become enemies of the state because they threaten the stability required for that investment climate.
This connects directly to another example they give, the Philippines under Marcos.
Yes, a perfect illustration. There was a ruling by the Philippine Supreme Court that prohibited foreign ownership of land.
A nationalist ruling.
A very nationalist ruling designed to protect local resources for local people. When Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, one of his first moves was to reverse that ruling.
To please the investors.
To restore the favorable climate. The authors quote an American oil man who was there at the time. He said, "Marcos says we'll pass the laws you need. Just tell us what you want."
Wow.
That is the essence of the client state. It is a service provider for foreign capital, and its tool is repression.
So we've established the political and economic structure, but maintaining this kind of unpopular regime requires violence, a lot of it.
You can't just ask people politely to starve while foreign companies get rich.
No. And this is where the deep dive gets into the heavy data.
This is Section 3, the economics of terror.
The authors present a correlation here that really stops you in your tracks. They analyze the relationship between U.S. aid and human rights violations.
And what they find is not what you expect, or at least not what you'd hope for.
Not at all. But let's be real, positive relationship is a vague term. Are we talking about a slight tick upward? Because correlation isn't causation. And how did they actually measure something as horrifying as torture?
That's the wild part. They didn't use their own data, which could be accused of bias. They used the U.S. government's own categorization of human rights violators from congressional reports.
So they used the State Department's own lists.
Exactly. They took the 10 nations explicitly flagged by Congress as systemic torture states. We're talking Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, the worst of the worst. And they plotted the flow of U.S. aid during the exact years the torture was at its peak.
And what did the graph look like?
It wasn't a slight tick, it was a spike. A massive spike. They found a strong, undeniable positive correlation. The more a regime violated human rights, the more likely they were to receive U.S. military and economic aid.
Can you give a specific example?
Chile is a classic one. When the military junta under Pinochet took over in 1973 and the torture centers opened, U.S. aid didn't drop.
It must have dropped.
It increased by 500% compared to the previous democratic years under Allende.
500%. That seems almost impossible to believe. It flies in the face of everything we are told about America promoting freedom and democracy.
It seems impossible.
Why would we pay them more when they start torturing?
It's only counterintuitive if you listen to the rhetoric. If you look at the system incentives we just discussed, it makes perfect chilling sense.
Because the torture produces the stability.
Exactly. The logic, according to the authors, is this. U.S. aid isn't flowing to torturers because the officials like torture. The State Department isn't full of sadists. The aid flows to them because the torture is the tool used to suppress the unions and the peasant leagues. The torture creates the investment climate.
And investment follows that climate.
Therefore, the investment and the aid follow the torture.
It's a mechanism. The torture is the overhead cost of the business model.
It is. And the U.S. role isn't just passive funding. It's not just writing a check and looking away. The authors discuss technology transfer.
That sounds technical.
It means we weren't just sending money. We were sending the tools of repression, the know-how.
This is the part of the book that really made me shudder. The Dan Mitrione case in Uruguay.
It is a chilling example of the deep level of involvement. Dan Mitrione was a U.S. police advisor stationed in Uruguay. Now, his job title was advisor. But the source describes something much darker.
What did he advise on?
He arranged for the local police to get newer, more advanced electric needles of varying thickness.
Electric needles.
Yes, for torture. Some were so thin they could be slipped between the teeth or under fingernails. The source notes that a Uruguayan police official understood this equipment, came inside the U.S. Embassy's diplomatic pouch.
Wait, in the diplomatic pouch?
Yes.
That is a level of involvement that goes way beyond turning a blind eye. You are talking about using diplomatic channels, usually reserved for treaties and state secrets, to smuggle torture devices.
It demonstrates a deep structural commitment to the process. It creates what the authors call a solar system of terror.
A solar system?
They use the metaphor of the sun and planets. The U.S. is the sun, providing the energy, the funding, the technology. And orbiting around it are these torture states. Brazil, Chile, Iran under the Shah, Indonesia. They are the planets.
And they can't exist without the sun's energy.
They orbit within the gravitational pull of U.S. economic and military power. They are dependent on it.
Okay, so if the system is so pervasive and the data on aid and torture correlates so strongly, why don't we see it that way?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why do we still think of terrorism as something other people do to us? Why do we turn on the TV and see terrorist attack only when a bomb goes off in a market, but not when a government disappears 5,000 people?
That is the central question of Section 4. Retail terror versus wholesale terror.
This is a semantic trap the authors really want us to understand.
It is all about how we define language to shape perception. The authors distinguish between two types of terror. First, there is retail terror.
Retail terror, that sounds small scale, like buying a candy bar versus buying a pallet of them.
The analogy is apt. Relative to state violence, it is small scale. Retail terror is violence committed by individuals or marginal groups.
Insurgents, rebels.
Insurgents, rebels, small radical factions, it is sporadic, it is limited in scale, a bombing here, an assassination there. It is terrifying for the people involved, absolutely no question.
And wholesale terror.
Wholesale terror is violence committed by the state, the police, the army, the officially sanctioned death squads.
So this is systematic.
It is systematic. It is industrial in scale. It claims vastly more lives. Thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. It is the difference between a homemade bomb and a fleet of B-52s.
But when we watch the news, when we read the headlines, which one is called terrorism?
Almost exclusively the retail terror.
Right.
When a rebel group throws a bomb, it's terrorism. When the state carpet bombs a village or disappears 10,000 union leaders, it is called police action or protective reaction or simply maintenance of order.
It's a linguistic trick. By controlling the definition, you control the moral high ground.
It is a massive trick. This semantic trap allows the U.S. and its client states to portray themselves as counter-terrorists even when they are doing the majority of the killing.
They're fighting the retail terrorists with wholesale slaughter.
But only the retail side gets the label.
The authors take this even further with their categorization of bloodbaths. They actually categorize mass killings based on their political utility to the United States.
This part feels cynical, but it's an incredibly useful framework for analyzing the news, even today.
It really is. They identify 4 types of bloodbaths.
Let's run through them. First, benign bloodbaths.
Benign, as in harmless.
A benign bloodbath is one committed by a friendly or an irrelevant regime. It's benign not because people aren't dying, thousands might be dying, but because it's harmless to U.S. interests.
It doesn't affect the investment climate.
Exactly. The examples they give from that era are the massacres in East Pakistan or Burundi. The West largely ignores them. They don't make the front page. They're just tragic, faraway events.
Okay. Then there are constructive bloodbaths.
This is the darkest category. This is the one that's hard to stomach. A constructive bloodbath is one that actually advances U.S. interests.
How can mass murder be constructive?
It's committed by a client state, usually to exterminate the left, to wipe out any popular opposition to the pro-investment model. The prime example is Indonesia in 1965.
That was a massive slaughter.
Unbelievably massive. Between 500,000 and 1 million people killed. Communists, unionists, teachers, artists. But because it destroyed the Communist Party and opened Indonesia to Western investment.
It was welcomed.
It was welcomed in the West. It was viewed as stabilizing. It was a constructive mass murder. The media at the time actually cheered it on. Time magazine called it the best news for years in Asia.
That's chilling. Okay, third category, nefarious bloodbaths.
These are the ones we all hear about. These are the ones committed by official enemies. Cambodia under Pol Pot is the key example here.
And the media reaction is the opposite of benign.
Completely the opposite. These are highly publicized. The media generates massive outrage.
Yeah.
They're used to prove the evil of the enemy's system, whether it's communism or some other official enemy.
And finally, the fourth one, mythical bloodbaths.
These are events that are fabricated or vastly exaggerated to justify intervention or continued conflict. The authors point to allegations made during the Vietnam War predictions of massacres that would supposedly happen if the U.S. left, which were used to keep the war funding going.
So the reality of the violence, the number of dead, the suffering matters less than who is doing it and who benefits from it.
That is the core insight. And this leads us directly into the media analysis, because the media is the mechanism that sorts these events into those categories for the public.
Right. Section 5. The media as a policy support system. And for this, the authors present a comparative analysis that is honestly devastating. They call it the ultimate control group.
It is a perfect scientific comparison. You couldn't design a better experiment to test the theory.
What's the setup?
You have 2 mass atrocities happening in the exact same time period, the mid to late 1970s. They're in the same region of the world, Southeast Asia. And the scale of the suffering is comparable relative to the populations involved.
But the political context is the complete opposite.
Exactly. Case A is Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge are the perpetrators. They are a communist regime, an official enemy of the United States. This is a nefarious bloodbath.
And the media reaction. We already know this one.
Massive coverage, outrage, front page stories day after day. The New York Times is running editorials denouncing the genocide. The networks are showing heart-wrenching footage of the refugees.
And the system goal here is what?
The authors argued the goal here is to discredit socialism, to discredit communism, and retroactively justify the U.S. war in Vietnam. See? Look what happens when we leave. This is the horror we were trying to prevent.
Okay, so that's case A. Now, case B, East Timor.
East Timor. In 1975, Indonesia invades its much smaller neighbor, East Timor. Now remember, Indonesia under Suharto is a key U.S. client state. It's one of our planets, a constructive bloodbath actor.
And what was the U.S. involvement in that invasion?
The U.S. provided 90% of the arms used in the invasion.
90%. That is not involvement. That is sponsorship. That's enabling.
It is sponsorship. And they provided the crucial diplomatic cover at the United Nations. The U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, actually brags in his memoirs about this.
Brags about it.
He brags about blocking the UN from taking any effective action to stop the slaughter. I want to read his quote because it is staggering. He said, "The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success."
Wow, he is proud of it. He is proud of blocking the UN from stopping a massacre because the State Department wanted it to happen.
Because it was a constructive bloodbath. Indonesia is a major resource hub, a key anti-communist domino. We wanted good relations with the Suharto regime, no matter the cost in Timorese lives.
So given that, what was the media reaction to East Timor compared to Cambodia?
I'm guessing it wasn't front-page news. It was a near-total blackout. Silence. When it was mentioned at all, it was framed as civil war or regional disturbance, not an invasion by U.S. armed power.
So no outrage.
The New York Times index of coverage, which the authors analyze, shows a massive disparity. Columns and columns of text for Cambodia, barely a footnote for East Timor, where the per capita death toll was arguably higher.
So if you were a regular person reading the paper in 1976, you would know everything about the crimes of Pol Pot.
You would be an expert on it.
And you would know nothing about the crimes of Suharto, even though your tax dollars were paying for Suharto's guns.
Exactly. The conclusion the authors draw is stark. The free press does not report news based on the scale of human suffering. It reports based on political utility.
Worthy and unworthy victims.
If the victims are killed by our enemies, they are worthy victims. We mourn them. Their stories are told. If they are killed by our friends with our guns, they are unworthy victims. We ignore them.
So the free press functions similarly to a state propaganda agency.
But again, without the direct censorship. It's internalized. The editors, the journalists, they know what is a story and what isn't. An atrocity by an enemy is a story. An atrocity by an ally is a problem.
It's filtering reality to support state policy. It really makes you question every headline you see. Why is this a crisis now? Why is this other thing being ignored?
Precisely. And this filter applies to how we view U.S. intervention itself. Let's look at the mechanics of that intervention in Section 6.
We are going back to Vietnam for a moment, specifically the Phoenix program. This is another term that sounds benign.
It sounds like rising from the ashes. It's a very positive name for a very dark program. The Phoenix program is a critical example of wholesale terror disguised as counterinsurgency.
What was its goal?
The stated goal was to dismantle the political infrastructure of the enemy, the Viet Cong, in the villages of South Vietnam.
And dismantle is a euphemism. It sounds like taking apart a Lego set.
It meant assassination, kidnapping, and torture on an administrative scale. The authors argue this wasn't just war in the traditional sense of soldiers fighting soldiers.
It was a bureaucratic program of murder.
It was an administrative massacre. It was a bureaucratic program designed to identify and eliminate civilians who supported the wrong side. They had quotas, they had lists, they had incentives for body counts.
And then we see similar mechanics in Latin America. The rise of the national security state in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay.
We see the same pattern, the systematic destruction of any form of popular organization. Civil society itself is the target.
And this leads to a fascinating point the authors make about the church in these countries.
Yes, the role of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, the authors mention that in many of these states, the church became the main opposition force. Which is interesting because the church is usually seen as a conservative establishment institution.
It wasn't that the church suddenly became radicalized, though some elements did through liberation theology. The larger point is that the church was the only thing left.
What do you mean?
The military juntas had destroyed everything else. The unions were gone. The political parties were banned. The peasant leagues were crushed. Student organizations were infiltrated and dismantled.
So the church was the last man standing.
It was the only institution with enough international protection and enough physical space, like actual church buildings, to voice any dissent whatsoever. It became the default home of the resistance because everything else had been bulldozed.
And the authors point out the media bias regarding refugees from these conflicts. This is another area where that worthy versus unworthy victim distinction is crystal clear.
It is stark. The U.S. press, during the Cold War, would focus heavily on Soviet dissidents, like Andrei Sakharov or Nitin Sharansky.
They were heroes, household names?
They were heroes, they were on the news constantly, and rightly so, their struggle was real. But at the very same time, thousands upon thousands of Latin Americans were fleeing U.S. client states, fleeing torture, fleeing death squads in Argentina and Chile.
And they weren't treated as heroes.
They were largely invisible, or if they made it to the U.S. border, they were treated as economic migrants.
Not political refugees.
To acknowledge them as political refugees would be to acknowledge that our client states, our planets, were repressive regimes that create refugees. And that was politically unacceptable.
So the Soviet dissident gets a parade. The Latin American refugee gets deportation.
That's the pattern. The system is remarkably consistent.
It's amazing how consistent it is. Once you see the blueprint, you can't unsee it. It's like putting on those glasses in the movie They Live.
That is the power of the systems analysis. Let's try to map this out explicitly. We've talked about the parts, but let's put the machine together and look at the feedback loop.
Okay, let's build the system map. Let's make it explicit for everyone listening.
First, we have the actors.
Who are the key players in this system?
Well, you have the U.S. state agencies, the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA. They're provided the arms, the training, the aid.
Right, the official state power. Then the corporation.
The multinational corporations.
Yeah.
They're providing the investment capital, but they're also the ones demanding order and low wages.
Okay, and then you have the local players.
You have the client regimes, the subfascists. They are the service providers. They provide the repression and torture needed to guarantee that order.
And finally, the media.
And the media, both domestic and international, which provides the narrative cover. They filter the information, creating the worthy and unworthy victims.
Okay, those are the actors. What are the incentives driving them?
The primary driver, according to the authors, is always investment access, the need to open up and secure foreign markets for U.S. capital.
And a close second is labor control.
Labor control, keeping the underlying population passive and cheap.
And the narratives used to sell this whole system to the public.
The public narratives are human rights, which is used as a rhetorical weapon against enemies, but conveniently ignored for friends. And security, which usually means security for the investors, but profounded security for the general population.
So the list goes like this. Repression by a client state leads to stability.
A very specific kind of stability.
That stability attracts foreign investment.
Which is the goal.
That investment cements U.S. government support for the repressive regime.
Because now American interests are at stake.
That U.S. support enables media normalization of the situation.
Or just a media blackout.
Right. And from that, public consent is manufactured, or at least public apathy. And so the repression continues.
That is the cycle. It is a self-reinforcing machine. Each part strengthens the others.
Which brings us to the crisis in perception. This is the title of our show, but it's also the core intellectual problem the book addresses.
It is. We often look at U.S. foreign policy, and we use words like hypocrisy or failure.
Right. We say, it's so hypocritical. We say we support democracy, but we support all these dictators. It's a failure of our values.
We see the contradiction, and we assume it's a mistake. We think if only the president knew what was really happening, or we just need better implementation of our ideals.
We assume the goal is actually to promote human rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Chomsky and Herman are saying it is not a failure. It is functioning exactly as designed.
That is the hard pill to swallow. That's the sentence that got the book pulped.
It is. Because if you judge the system by its stated values, freedom, democracy, human rights, then yes, it looks like a hypocritical, broken mess. But if you judge the system by its actual outputs, maximizing return on investment, securing geopolitical control, maintaining favorable investment climates, then the system is a resounding success.
The human rights failure is just an overhead cost, a business expense.
Precisely. It's an acceptable, externalized cost of doing business. The crisis only exists in our perception because we are looking at the wrong metrics.
We're listening to the speeches from the White House lawn.
Not watching the flow of capital and weapons.
So the hypocrisy isn't a dug in the system, it's a required feature. You need the beautiful rhetoric of freedom to sell the brutal reality of control.
And you need the media to maintain that gap between the rhetoric and the reality, to make the contradiction invisible.
This has been intense. It's a framework that once you understand it, you start seeing its echoes everywhere.
It forces you to reevaluate how you consume the news. It's not just about fake news or bias in the modern sense. It's about the fundamental structure of what gets reported and why.
It's about what is considered important enough to be a story in the first place.
That is the goal, to see the structure beneath the headlines.
Before we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought, a question to carry with you.
When you turn on the news tonight or scroll through your feed tomorrow and you see the word terrorism, ask yourself, whose definition is being used?
Are you seeing the retail violence of the week, which is terrifying but limited?
Or are you seeing the wholesale violence of the strong, disguised as security or stability? And if you aren't seeing the wholesale violence, ask yourself why.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.